Hello everyone. Welcome to Nightmare Horrors. Thank you for joining us for another episode of true scary horror stories to help you relax and fall asleep. I know this story is meant to help you fall asleep, but before that, please make sure you like the video and subscribe. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Lay back, relax, and enjoy. The storm broke with a thunderclap that shook the building, the kind of noise that snaps through sleep like a splintering branch. The rain followed, hammering against the glass with relentless force, filling the air with a steady rhythm of nature's insistence. Inside the dimly lit room, shadows shifted, soft, fleeting shapes cast by the glow of a distant street lamp, distorted by the water streaking down the window pane. And then it came. The sound. A scratching. Gentle at first, barely audible over the rain, but there. The persistent scrape of something against the glass, deliberate and unyielding, too rhythmic to be the storm. He stirred in the darkness, the faint movement of a body emerging from restless sleep. It wasn't just the sound that roused him. No, it was the wrongness of it. The way it crept under his skin, lodging there like a splinter. It didn't make sense. Not here. Not on the 14th floor. He froze, caught in the liminal space between dream and waking, every breath shallow, the air around him thick and still. Lightning flashed, illuminating the rain-slicked window for the briefest moment, and in that instant, just a blink of light, something was there. A shape. Indistinct. Wrong. Gone before the mind could fully grasp it. And yet, the scratching continued. The storm had not relented, its fury now a constant deafening cascade of rain that battered the roof of the small, isolated cabin. The sound was sharp and invasive, the kind of downpour that seemed to press against the world itself, as though trying to break through every barrier, every wall. The wind howled in irregular bursts, winding its way through the trees and rattling the shutters with an almost intentional persistence. Inside the cabin, it was far from quiet. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of time and weather, their creaks seeming to answer the storm outside with reluctant acknowledgement. Each noise, no matter how faint, carried a sense of life. A shifting floorboard here, a settling corner there. It was the kind of space where silence could never be trusted, where the absence of sound only amplified the sense of being watched. The candlelight flickered, weak and unreliable, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. These shadows stretched and danced, transforming ordinary objects into grotesque shapes, unfamiliar and vaguely menacing. It was the kind of darkness that didn't just conceal but seemed to move on its own, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And he sat there, the solitary traveler, drenched from the rain, his coat still dripping onto the wooden floor in a steady, rhythmic pattern. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together, the cold having settled into his bones. He had come here for shelter, for warmth, a reprieve from the storm that had caught him unprepared on the winding forest road. But the longer he stayed, the more the cabin felt wrong. The wind pressed against the walls again, a low, mournful wail that made the small room seem impossibly vast. And then, beneath the chaos of the storm, another sound began to surface. Faint at first, barely distinguishable, but there. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping. No, not tapping. Footsteps. The sound came from above, where the attic would be, if this cabin even had one. A single step. Slow, then another. Each deliberate, each impossibly loud in the traveler's mind. the faintest creak of wood as weight shifted above him. He sat perfectly still, his breath shallow, his ears straining to separate the sound from the storm. He looked up. The ceiling was low, the beams exposed and old, their edges rough and splintered. The sound grew louder, as if whatever was up there was drawing closer, moving toward him with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Another creak, another deliberate step. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, the roar of the rain and the scream of the wind swallowed by the oppressive weight of this new sound. It filled the room, pressing in from all sides, until even the faint whispers of the storm seemed to join it, an eerie harmony of voices layered beneath the footsteps. He couldn't move. His body betrayed him, paralyzed by the primal fear that told him to stay still, to stay silent. The kind of fear that whispered, if you don't acknowledge it, maybe it won't notice you. But deep down, he knew it already had. The footsteps stopped directly above him. The air inside the cabin had changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the faint pressure you feel before a storm breaks. But now, it was unmistakable, a heaviness that pressed down on the room, on the walls, on his chest, the kind of weight that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. He stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor, the sound startlingly loud in the oppressive silence. His eyes flicked upward again, to the ceiling where the footsteps had been. Nothing. Just the dark, unmoving beams above. And yet, the sensation of being watched had only grown stronger, more insistent, like a presence that refused to stay hidden any longer. Then he heard it, a soft creak, not above, but ahead. The hallway stretched before him, narrow and shrouded in shadows. The single door at its end was ajar, just slightly, the kind of opening that was neither careless nor natural. It had been closed earlier, he was sure of it. He moved toward it slowly, every step cautious, the wooden floor groaning beneath his weight. His hand gripped the flashlight tightly, his knuckles white against the cold metal. The beam wavered, unsteady, as though the light itself was reluctant to pierce the darkness ahead. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally as he walked, the shadows deepening with each step. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. His breathing was shallow now, each inhale and exhale controlled, measured. Lightning flashed outside, and for a fleeting moment, the hallway was illuminated. That's when he saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the door. It wasn't clear, not fully. Just a shadow, a vague outline of something taller than it should have been, its edges sharp but wrong, like it didn't belong in the space it occupied. The light disappeared as quickly as it had come, plunging the hallway back into darkness. He stopped, frozen mid-step. The flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam flickering as though responding to his fear. He didn't want to move closer, didn't want to confirm what he thought he'd seen. But something pulled at him, a need to understand, to confront, to prove to himself that it wasn't real. He took another step, then another. The door at the end of the hallway creaked open, just slightly, as though inviting him in. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers brushing against the rough wood of the door frame. That's when it slammed shut with a force that echoed through the cabin, the sound so sudden and violent that he stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The whispers began almost immediately. Low, insistent murmurs seeped through the cracks of the door, a chorus of voices layered atop one another. They weren't loud, but they were there, unmistakable, as though the door itself was breathing out their words. He leaned forward, straining to catch their meaning. but the voices were too distorted, too alien. Then came the sound of breathing, deep, deliberate, just on the other side of the door. He stood outside the door for what felt like an eternity, his breath shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. The whispers behind the door hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown more distinct, though their meaning remained elusive, the cadence unnerving in its deliberate rhythm. And that breathing, low, heavy, deliberate, still lingered, pressing against his resolve like a hand at his back, urging him forward. He didn't want to open the door. Every fibre of his being screamed against it, the primal part of his brain issuing warnings it knew would go unheeded. But he couldn't leave it alone. Not now. Whatever was inside he had to see. His trembling hand gripped the door handle. It was cold. Far colder than it should have been. The sensation travelled up his arm, spreading into his chest, but he ignored it. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned the handle. The door opened with a groan that cut through the whispers like a blade, and as it swung inward, the voices ceased abruptly, leaving only silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The room beyond was small, its air stale and cloying. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by his entrance, and the single window on the far wall was cracked, allowing a faint draft to creep in. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing walls stained with damp streaks and peeling wallpaper. And then he saw it, a table in the center of the room, its surface thick with dust, as though untouched for years. On it rested a single object, a diary, its leather cover cracked with age, its edges frayed. He approached it cautiously, his footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. The flashlight wavered, its light casting unsettling shapes on the walls as he bent down to examine the book. Dust swirled in the air as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the aged leather. Opening the diary felt like an intrusion, the kind of act that carries an unspoken consequence. But his hands moved on their own, the pages brittle beneath his touch. The writing was faint, scrawled in a hurried hand, the ink faded but legible. "To whoever finds this," the first line read, "don't trust the whispers. It knows you're here now." He read the words again, his mind struggling to process their meaning. Don't trust the whispers. It knows you're here now. The weight of the warning settled over him like a shroud, and for the first time, he became acutely aware of the stillness in the room. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper, as though the room itself was alive, watching. A sudden, deafening bang shattered the silence, causing him to jump. The sound reverberated through the room, echoing off the walls and rattling the table. He spun around, the flashlight jerking wildly, illuminating corners that seemed impossibly dark, as though the light couldn't fully penetrate them. There was nothing. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as he swept the room again. The shadows seemed to pulse, shifting in ways they shouldn't, defying the movement of the light. He stepped back toward the table, his hand brushing against the diary, as though it could anchor him in this moment. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, where the light barely reached, a figure stood. It didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't seem fully solid. Its form was vague, its edges undefined, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. But it was there, watching him. His flashlight beam snapped to the corner, and the figure was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable, an oppressive absence of sound that seemed to press against his ears. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the room, every corner, every shadow. And then, lightning struck. The flash illuminated the room in an instant of stark clarity, and for that brief blinding moment, he saw it again, this time reflected in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Its face was wrong, distorted, its eyes hollow, its mouth stretched into an unnatural shape that spoke of something far removed from humanity. And just as quickly, the light was gone, plunging the room back into darkness. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he turned toward the mirror, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. The reflection stared back at him, his own face, pale and drawn, the same, and yet not. Something moved behind him in the reflection. He spun around, but the room was empty, and then the whispers returned. The room felt heavier now, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on every surface, every corner, every breath. He hadn't moved from where he stood, his hand still gripping the edge of the table as though letting go would somehow invite the shadows closer. The whispers had stopped again, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence that seemed alive with potential. And then faintly, a sound. Chime. It was soft, subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of sound that shouldn't have belonged here. A clock striking in the middle of the night. His head turned slowly toward it, the sound pulling his gaze to the far side of the room. There, mounted high on the wall, was an old clock. Its face was faded, the glass cracked, the hands frozen in place. 3:33. He stared at it, unblinking, as the chime echoed once more, soft but persistent, an eerie contradiction to the clock's apparent state of disrepair. It wasn't just the sound. It was the timing, the precision. It felt deliberate, as though the room itself had decided to remind him of its presence. He took a step back, his breathing shallow, his movement slow and uncertain. The floor creaked beneath his weight, a creak that didn't end when he stopped moving. It continued, soft and deliberate, traveling along the walls, across the ceiling. It was as if something within the structure was shifting, crawling, pressing against the wooden frame. The sound followed him as he moved through the cabin, a low groaning punctuated by sharp cracks, like bones bending in ways they shouldn't. His flashlight darted from corner to corner, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. And then, there it was again, the clock, chime. He turned back toward it, but something was wrong. The hands, they hadn't moved, still frozen at 3:33, but the chime had grown louder, sharper, as though the sound itself had taken on weight. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in a brief, violent burst of light, and on the walls, he saw them. Words. They were faint, scratched into the peeling wallpaper, visible only for an instant. Leave before it finds you. His flashlight darted back to the walls, but the message was gone. Only the faded, damp wallpaper remained, blank and unassuming. The rain outside grew louder, the storm seeming to press against the building, its weight shaking the fragile structure. He stepped closer to the window, drawn by an uneasy compulsion. The glass was streaked with rain, water distorting the outside world into a swirling chaos of movement. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely discernible against the storm, but it didn't move like the rain, didn't follow the chaotic rhythm of nature. It was still, standing just outside the window, impossibly high above the ground. His flashlight swept toward the glass, the beam catching the faint outline of a figure. Its edges were blurred, its features indistinct, but it was there, watching. Another flash of lightning, and it was gone. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the rain hammering against the glass as though trying to break through. And then he noticed the reflections. They shouldn't have been there. In the mirror above the fireplace, his reflection stood stiff and still, staring back at him with wide, hollow eyes. But it wasn't him. The movement was wrong, the posture off, the expression frozen in something between fear and malice. He turned away from the mirror, his pulse pounding, but the reflections followed. Every surface that could catch his image seemed to twist it, distort it, turn it into something that wasn't his own. In the window, the rain streaked across a face that didn't move when he moved. And then came the laughter. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was low, distant, and distorted, like the static-filled sound of an old radio struggling to find its signal. It came from the walls, from the air, from nowhere. It wasn't human. The flashlight began to flicker again, the beam growing weaker with every passing second. He felt the weight of the shadows growing around him, pressing closer, stretching longer. The clock chimed again and again. The sound now filled the room, deafening, relentless, despite the hands remaining frozen. His chest tightened as a new noise joined the cacophony, a soft tapping coming from inside the walls. The sound grew louder, more frantic, until it was joined by something far worse, scratching. The walls began to groan, bending inward as though something inside was pushing against them, trying to escape. The wood splintered in places, small cracks appearing as the scratching turned into clawing, tearing at the very structure of the cabin. Lightning flashed again, and the words returned, etched in the same jagged script. It's too late. He stumbled back, his legs weak, his mind racing with panic. The flashlight slipped from his hand, its beams swinging wildly before going dark. The storm raged on outside, but it was no longer the loudest thing in the room. The laughter, the scratching, the chimes, they all blended into a cacophony that drowned out everything else, a soundscape of chaos and terror that seemed to have no source, no end. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. The air was still, the rain outside a distant hum, the whispers and scratching gone. But the clock, it chimed once more, and then the walls began to bleed. The cabin groaned in protest as he stumbled backward, every sound amplified, every creak and whisper pressing down on his sanity. His chest heaved, his breath sharp and erratic as his flashlight sputtered weakly back to life, casting faint, trembling light into the oppressive darkness. The words on the walls had faded again, the message etched into his mind more deeply than any surface could hold. It's too late. He wanted to run, to fling himself out into the storm and away from whatever nightmare had taken root here. But something stronger than fear held him captive. A terrible curiosity, a need to know. The air shifted suddenly, colder now, heavy with a damp chill that clung to his skin. The silence was unnatural, dense, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. And then he heard it, a hollow thud, coming from somewhere deeper within the cabin. He turned sharply, the flashlight beam jerking toward the source of the noise, and his eyes caught the edge of the bookshelf. It looked ordinary enough at first glance, but then it moved. Not a lot, just enough. A subtle vibration, a faint scraping sound as if something behind it had shifted, nudging the heavy furniture forward an inch. He stared at it, unmoving, his mind racing to rationalize what he'd just seen. Another thud. This time it was louder, more deliberate, coming directly from behind the bookshelf. His legs felt weak as he approached it, each step slow and hesitant. The flashlight quivered in his grip, the shadows it cast seeming to stretch and contort with each passing moment. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the dusty wood. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, as if responding to his touch, the bookshelf groaned and tilted forward, revealing a narrow passage behind it. The opening was small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, and the air that drifted out was colder than ice. It carried a faint metallic tang, the unmistakable scent of something ancient and decayed. His flashlight flickered as he leaned forward, its beam barely piercing the darkness beyond. He shouldn't go down there. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to abandon the cabin and never look back. But his feet moved anyway, carrying him forward, his body betraying the screaming in his mind. The passage was narrow, the walls damp and uneven, and the floor beneath him felt unstable, as though it might give way at any moment. The further he descended, the darker it grew, the flashlight's light seeming to weaken with every step. The air grew heavier, the metallic scent stronger, mixed now with something else, something acrid and foul. At the end of the passage, the space opened into a room. The walls were lined with strange, jagged symbols carved deeply into the stone, their meaning alien and incomprehensible. The symbols glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center of the room stood a series of candles, their flames frozen in unnatural stillness. They burned without flickering, their light too steady, too deliberate. The air around them seemed to distort, as though the space itself was bending to their will. And then there was the painting. It hung on the far wall, larger than it should have been, its frame warped and blackened as though touched by fire. The image it held was worse than any shadow or whisper he had encountered so far. It was a creature, though to call it that felt wrong, reductive. Its hollow eyes stared out from the canvas, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. Its mouth was a jagged gash, stretched into an expression that was neither a scream nor a smile, but something that lived uneasily between the two. The painting's eyes followed him as he moved, a presence as palpable as the air in his lungs. He couldn't look away, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The whispers returned then, louder now, more insistent, but this time they weren't fragmented, they weren't layered, they were one voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The words cut through him like a blade, sharp and final, spoken with a certainty that made his knees buckle. His flashlight flickered wildly as the voice grew louder, deeper, resonating in the very walls around him. "You shouldn't have come here." The sound became physical, pressing against his skull, his chest, every nerve in his body screaming as he turned toward the center of the room. That's when he saw it. The chest. It was small, no larger than a footlocker, but its presence dominated the space. The wood was dark and splintered, its edges bound with rusted iron, and it shook violently, as though something inside was trying to escape. The whispers stopped. The room was silent again, save for the rhythmic pounding coming from within the chest. He approached it slowly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step forward felt like an eternity, the distance stretching impossibly long, as though the chest were receding into the darkness, even as he moved closer. His hand hovered above the latch, trembling. He didn't want to open it, didn't need to see what was inside to know it wasn't meant for him. But the same force that had driven him here, that had kept him moving through the storm and the shadows and the whispers, compelled him to lift the lid. The latch gave way with a soft click, and the chest fell open. What he saw inside froze him to the core. It was his own face, staring back at him. But it wasn't right. The features were distorted, twisted into an expression of unrelenting agony. The mouth was stretched wide, as though screaming, but no sound came. The eyes were filled with terror, staring directly into his own, as though pleading with him. And then it moved. The face twisted, its mouth opening wider, the scream that had been silent finally breaking free in a burst of sound so loud and so wrong that it brought him to his knees. The voice returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a single, deafening proclamation. It's too late. And the chest slammed shut. The chest slammed shut with a force that echoed through the underground room, the sound reverberating off the walls and seeming to crawl under his skin. The air was suffocating now, thick with a foul stench that made his stomach churn. His ears rang, the echoes of the scream from his own distorted face still rattling in his skull. He staggered backward, his legs weak, his vision blurred by tears he didn't remember shedding. The glow of the symbols on the walls pulsed faster, more erratically, as if responding to his fear. The whispers began to stir again, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, layered and chaotic, like voices speaking over one another, in a language that didn't belong to this world. He turned toward the passageway, his flashlight flickering weakly, casting jagged shadows that danced like living things. He had to leave. He couldn't stay here. Not in this room. Not in this house. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever had claimed this place, it was coming for him now. The passage seemed longer than before, the darkness deeper, as though the space itself were stretching, twisting to keep him trapped. The air felt alive, pressing against him from all sides, making every step harder, every breath shallower. His mind screamed at him to move faster, but his body refused to cooperate, sluggish and heavy, as if the room's oppressive presence had seeped into his very bones. When he finally reached the base of the stairs, he hesitated. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, the words still incomprehensible, but filled with a malevolent intent. The walls around him groaned, the sound echoing up the narrow stairway, and for a moment he swore he saw movement, something slithering just out of sight, a shadow within the shadows. He forced himself to climb, each step an agonizing effort, his flashlight casting frantic, sputtering light onto the crumbling stone walls. The whispers seemed to follow him, growing sharper, closer, until they weren't whispers at all. They were words. You shouldn't have come. The voice was everywhere now, filling the passage, vibrating in his chest, low and guttural and impossibly loud. It's too late. His foot slipped on the final step, sending him sprawling into the main room of the cabin. The flashlight rolled from his hand, its weak beam casting erratic light across the floor before winking out completely. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his heartbeat a deafening drumbeat in his ears. The cabin had changed. The walls were no longer the weathered wood he'd seen before, but something else entirely. Dark, pulsating, as though they were alive, breathing in unison with the storm outside. The floor beneath him was warped, uneven, shifting beneath his weight, as though it might give way at any moment. The storm raged outside, but the sound of the rain was distant now, muted by the oppressive roar of the voice that filled the cabin. You belong to us. The words carried a finality that made his stomach drop. The door. He turned toward it, the only thing that still looked normal, still felt real. It was only a few steps away, but the space between him and escape stretched unnaturally, the distance impossibly long. He ran. The walls groaned in protest as he moved, the sound high-pitched and grating like nails on a chalkboard. Shadows erupted from the corners of the room, reaching for him, their forms twisting and writhing, faces appearing and disappearing within them, faces that looked like his own. He reached the door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was cold beneath his hands, colder than it should have been, and when he looked down, he realized it wasn't wood at all anymore. It was something darker, slick, and unyielding, as though the house itself had sealed him in. The voice came again, louder now, so close it felt as though it were coming from inside his own head. "You can't leave. You're already ours." The windows shattered all at once, the sound deafening, but instead of letting in the storm, they revealed nothing but darkness, an endless void that seemed to swallow the light. The room twisted violently, the walls bending inward, the floor rising and falling like the surface of a storm-tossed sea. He screamed, clawing at the door, pounding on it with all his strength, but the space around him continued to shift, to close in. The room seemed to pulse, alive with some terrible rhythm, and the voice rose to a crescendo, each word a hammer blow against his sanity. "You belong to us." The shadow surged forward, wrapping around him, pulling him away from the door and into the center of the room. He struggled, kicking and screaming, but they were stronger, their grip cold and unyielding. The ceiling above him began to crack, thin fissures spreading outward like veins, revealing more of that endless black void beyond. The cracks grew wider, and from them came a noise, a low, guttural laugh that shook the very foundation of the house. His screams grew louder, more desperate, as the floor beneath him opened up, revealing the same darkness that waited above. The last thing he saw was the clock, still stuck at 3:33, its hands motionless, its chime silent now. The shadows dragged him down, the void swallowing him whole, and as the room disappeared around him, the voice spoke one final time. "It's too late. You were ours the moment you stepped inside." Some stories don't end. They linger. They wait for you in the dark, in the corners of your mind, in the silence of your room, when the world has gone still. If you've ever felt eyes on you when no one was there, or heard a sound you couldn't explain, don't ignore it. Tell us your story in the comments below. Who knows? Your tale could inspire the next nightmare. And if you're brave enough to come back, subscribe now so you don't miss our next spine-chilling story, The Door That Never Closed. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut. We'll be waiting.